The story of this movement was very complex. It has its twists and its turns. This movement was opposed from without by kings and princes and emperors and even armed troops. From within, it encountered opposition and even undermining from some of the people who were closest to Luther himself. And before it was all over, at least a part of the Reformation stood at the head of a terrible, bitter war that took decades to fight, and it took Europe decades, if not centuries, to recover from. The Lutheran Reformation was not a revolution. It was a reformation. And at that, it has been called a fairly conservative Reformation. Luther did not hate the church. He loved the church. Luther wanted to get rid of things in the church that were against the Word of God, but he was not trying to get rid of everything. And that set Luther apart from a lot of the other reformers.
The Lutheran Reformation, of course, was not the only Reformation. There were many movements for reform within the church in Europe during that time. Many movements burgeoning up, and some were radical, some were violent, you could say. Some would burn churches and burn statues and burn any of the kind of elements of liturgical worship.
So basically, for most of Luther's reforming career, he had on one side the papacy, and he had on the other side these reformers who were trying to do, in the name of the Reformation, things that didn't really need to be done.
So Martin Luther nails the 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, and 4 years later, in 1521, he makes his famous stand before the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and he refuses to recant. Then for the next 9 years, neither the Pope nor Emperor Charles V does a whole lot to stop the Reformation. In fact, they spend some of that time actually fighting with each other over territory in Italy.
Luther, on the other hand, was building a new church. He edited the Latin Mass, taking out any references to the Lord's Supper as a sacrifice. Then he wrote his German Mass, a Mass in the language of the people, a Mass that included the singing of hymns and liturgical participation by the people. And so no longer were the priests the only participants in the divine service. He had already written his first hymnal and published it around 1524. That little hymnal sold widely across Europe, and his adversaries complained that the people are singing themselves into his doctrines.
So Luther is engaged, he's a very busy man. Not only is he engaged raising a family, he is still a professor of theology, so he's still teaching. He is delivering sermons on a continuing basis. He is finishing work on translation of the Bible. Several of his works go into multiple editions. He's dealing with printers, he's dealing with publishers, he's dealing with the authorities. So he's very busy.
One of the problems with the way we think about the Reformation typically is we think of it as only a theological phenomenon. There are many princes who followed the Lutheran Reformation not only because of its ideas, but because they got a good deal and got their land back.
People are people. They are motivated by all kinds of different things. And so you've got princes who are siding with Luther, some of them because they care about the theology, some of them because they just see a chance to maybe gain a little political angle here, or do something that's going to advance their cause for some other kind of selfish reason. So there's all kinds of reasons going on, and it's not simple. People are complicated today, people are complicated then.
So even though, putting an end to this rascal named Luther with his monk-ish squabble was a priority for the Emperor Charles V, it wasn't his highest priority. Keeping order in the empire was the highest priority of this emperor. So you got this Reformation fomenting among the masses, and you got the Pope and you got the Emperor, and each hoped that the other would take care of the problem.
For Charles, the problem is how the Holy Roman Empire had been kind of going for the last 500 years, as more and more power had been going into the hands of the princes, particularly the larger princes of the empire. One of the things most people don't understand about monarchy at this time is oftentimes monarchs did not have absolute power. They could not rule by decree, and they were especially beholden to the constitution of their territory. And the Holy Roman Empire had a very complex and complicated constitution. the empire is divided up into hundreds of little tiny statelets. So you have the big electors, you have bigger princes, you have some of these archbishops and bishops who rule territories. You also have these guys who are known as imperial knights who are directly under the authority of the emperor, and they could rule territories that are the size of a couple acres. So getting anything done in the empire is incredibly slow.
Charles V eventually calls on the Lutheran princes and free territories in Germany to explain their religious convictions. He wants to restore religious and political unity within the Holy Roman Empire. The Lutherans get together, and Martin Luther's friend, Professor Philip Melanchthon, writes what is known as the Augsburg Confession, and they present the confession to Emperor Charles in June of 1530.
That date really marks the birth of the Lutheran Church. As these Lutheran princes present the confession that they have signed, that they have stuck their necks out to present to the emperor, that represents the teaching of their churches based on Scripture, based on the Word of God, centering in the doctrine of justification by grace for Christ's sake, and not departing from the ancient church. That's a big point in the Augsburg Confession. The Lutherans are saying, we're not teaching anything new here. This is the Christian faith. In fact, they kind of come to a crescendo and say, not that we think our opponents have to agree with us in these things. We don't see how they can disagree.
So the Augsburg Confession, the beauty of it is that it's clear, it's concise, it's beautifully expressed. It's very easy to understand what are the central beliefs of Luther's theology. Politically is important because it gave the free imperial cities, the different princes, the different people within the Holy Roman Empire who had been attracted by Luther's ideas, a clear articulation of what those ideas were, and a way to sort of join together into a group, hey, this is what we believe.
So the Augsburg Confession is presented, and the emperor hears it, and his first response is, well, what are we going to do with this, and how are we going to settle this and get it fixed? And so he turns to the theologians who are representing the Catholic Church and basically gives them the responsibility. You need to respond to this, take care of it for me. And so they do, and they produce this thing called the Confutation, which is the Roman Catholics' official response to the Augsburg Confession. It was somewhat maybe hastily done.
So the first version of the Confutation that Charles received was such a mess that he was just like, no, you gotta go fix this. Melanchthon's initial response to the Confutation, I don't remember the exact words, it was something like childish and silly.
Much later, the Confutation would be cleaned up and published, but within the Confutation was a threat from the emperor. His Imperial Majesty Charles V also hopes and does not doubt that when the princes and estates have heard and understood this response, that they will now come to agreement in these things. However, if this generous and Christian admonition is ignored, then the elector, princes, and cities should know that His Imperial Majesty has sufficient cause as Roman Emperor and Christian King to act as a defender and advocate of the Catholic and Christian faith. This office and the dictates of his conscience will determine his future course of action. So in other words, Charles is saying, okay, you guys, knock it off. Fall back in line and be good Catholics again, or else.
And you always have to remember the political situation of Europe, that Charles V is not only the Holy Roman Emperor, he's also the King of Spain. So he has a lot of authority. We also have to remember that after 1492, with Columbus discovering the New World, Spain is going to be the recipient of a fairly large influx of gold and silver bullion from the New World. And this is one of the things that helps Charles finance some of his military operations. So many of the imperial cities and the states that had turned Protestant began to become very concerned they were going to be isolated and encircled and, attacked by the Catholic states. So they're going to form together into something called the Schmalkaldic League. The best way to think that is a defensive alliance. If you want a modern parallel, it would be like NATO. So it basically is an agreement among them that if one of them is attacked, the other ones will rally to their defense.
Americans think of April 15th as a deadline, as tax day. Well, Emperor Charles V, at the Diet of Augsburg, had given the Lutherans a deadline date, also April 15th, but this was their date by which they were supposed to come back into line with the church. Philip Melanchthon wrote a lengthy defense or apology of the Augsburg Confession. He had already started it back in Augsburg, and it was finally published in 1531. And in this he says, we are not going to agree to the confutation, and we are not going to be having our consciences violated. At one point he says, you know, our opponents are really not out for the truth. They're not even out for harmony. They're out for blood.
Before Charles can carry through on his threat, he is distracted by other things which compel him to put the Reformation essentially on the back burner for the next 15 years.
During that 15-year period, the Catholic Church had a major problem in putting together a united front against the Protestants. For one, there was a lot of disruption in papal leadership, which led to elections and all the politics that goes in with it. The other big issue is Charles was fighting with Francis I, one of the other major Catholic princes, over the Spanish territories in Italy. So you have an occasion where there are German, Spanish, French, and Swiss armies marching up and down the Italian peninsula, right in the heart of Roman Catholicism, and they're busy trying to settle this issue before they can deal with the Protestants. To make matters worse for Charles and the Spanish is they also have to deal with the ever-increasing Ottoman threat on their southern borders in the Mediterranean and in the Balkans. With these threats, there is no time to concentrate on the Lutheran and later Reformed threat.
He would like to deal with it, but he really can't. He's got other things going on. And so what ends up happening is the Reformation is able to function pretty much in a kind of little safe vacuum. And the work in Germany just continues apace. Luther keeps thinking, helping the churches figure things out, and it's just mushrooming and growing. And more people are siding with Luther, and more people are getting interested, and other theologians are arising too. Some of them sympathetic to Luther, some of them thinking he's not going far enough. And so things are getting a little more complicated as we go along here from within the Reformation. But politically and sociologically, everything's kind of in place for the Reformation just to keep on growing and prospering, and that's exactly what happens.
Luther and his colleagues are continuing to write in a variety of media. They are writing many of the things that they're writing in the language that the people can understand. The church, the established church, for its part, is slower in responding. Many of the responses come out in Latin. They're aimed more at a scholarly audience than at the general public. And furthermore, the church authorities were kind of confined by their own sense that you don't debate publicly with a heretic. You rebuke him, but after he's been rebuked, you just ignore him. And so the response to the Reformation on the part of the Roman authorities was not nearly as robust as the more nimble work of the Reformation in getting its message out.
The Schmalkaldic League also expanded during that 15-year lull. Although the League was formed as a religious alliance, it quickly became a political alliance as well. And even Catholic France, which persecuted and even executed Protestants in its own territory, began to support the Lutheran Schmalkaldic League financially. Why? France's King Francois and Charles V could not stand each other. And anytime Francois had a chance to make life more difficult for Charles, he took the opportunity. In addition to France, Denmark and England also offered support.
And this is all the more frustrating for Charles and for some of the hardline Catholic princes, because now the Protestants are organizing on a political scale.
So by 1545, the Lutherans were officially a big problem. They were established in Europe. I mean, Sweden was now Lutheran. Of the electors, those are the ones who elected the emperor, 3 of 7 of them were Lutheran. England had gone Anglican. So the wheels were coming off of this Holy Roman Empire.
In 1545, the Pope finally calls a council to officially deal with the Protestant problem. The council gathers in the northern Italian city of Trent. The Lutheran territories are invited to send delegations, but none of them send anyone. By this time, Martin Luther's health had deteriorated significantly. In early 1546, he preached his last sermon in Eisleben, the city of his birth. This and much more might be said concerning the gospel, but I am too weak, and we shall let it go at that. Those were the last words Luther spoke from the pulpit, and he died a few days later. Charles has had enough. He makes peace with France and then forms an alliance with the Catholic German princes. He also bribes the powerful Protestant Duke Maurice of Saxony by offering him the land and the elector title of another Protestant prince for switching sides and supporting the emperor. Shortly after Luther's death, Charles marches imperial troops into Germany. Spain and the Pope also send forces, and Charles is now ready to deal with the Lutheran Smalcaldic League.
You're going to see a gradual transition in the discourse between the Catholics and the Protestants, just where they just start knocking heads. So rather than talking with each other, they're talking at each other, and it becomes increasingly bitter and vitriolic.
If anyone saith that by faith alone the impious is justified, in such wise as to mean that nothing else is required to cooperate in order to the obtaining the grace of justification, let him be anathema, let him be damned. The Council of Trent.
When Emperor Charles V begins to march his troops to confront the Schmalkaldic League, some of the more skittish members, they fail to attack. Two other powerful members of the League fight over who has control of the main Schmalkaldic army. So the end result is that when the war starts, the Schmalkaldic League isn't ready. In fact, they're in chaos. By 1548, several key Lutheran princes were captured, and Charles forces the Lutherans to sign the Augsburg Interim. The Interim ordered Protestants to readopt traditional Catholic beliefs and practices, and to prepare for reintegration of the Lutherans into the Catholic Church.
We have a tendency to think of denominations. Here's the Lutheran teaching, here's the Catholic teaching. It wasn't that way for Luther and for the Reformers. They're simply trying to be the church. And they're saying, hey, the church needs to teach correctly. This is the correct teaching, and they're expecting everybody to kind of go along with this. What ends up happening, though, as things go along is the surprise is that Rome doesn't want to pay attention to the truth, and so they're going to be entrenched in their position, and the Reformers are saying, this is the God's truth. We can't let it go. We're not going to let it go because this is the truth. And we have a responsibility to the church, the whole comprehensive church, to teach God's truth. So we're not going to forsake that for the sake of going back to the Pope. We're not going to do that. We're not going to do it for political expediency. And so when finally the Smalcaldic War is over and the emperor's saying, okay, everybody come back. What do you mean come back? There's no coming back.
In an effort to keep the peace, Luther's colleague Philip Melanchthon did something. With a nod from Maurice, the Prince of Saxony, who had been Charles's great ally in the Smalcaldic War, Melanchthon prepared a new kind of substitute document to substitute for the Augsburg Interim. Very quickly, its opponents started referring to it as the Leipzig Interim.
The Protestant leaders refused to abide by the Augsburg Interim. What Melanchthon tried to do was split the difference, but he can only ask for so much because the Smalcaldic League did lose the war.
And Melanchthon's whole idea in this document was to retain the things that absolutely had to be retained. But if we're going to retain those things that absolutely have to be retained, like justification by grace through faith, we have to be not quite so picky about other things that are not so essential. Well, the problem was that lots of people got the false impression that because ceremonies were being conceded to the papists, now all of a sudden the whole Lutheran cause was being rolled back. And furthermore, even in that great essential of justification by faith, were compromises being made there. The term justification by faith did not appear in the Leipzig Interim. And so in time, The kind of folks who sympathized with Melanchthon in this sort of a compromise became known as the Philippists, the followers of Philip Melanchthon. They were opposed very strongly by people who said, no, we're the genuine, we're the Gnasio Lutherans.
Philip Melanchthon was serving on the faculty at the University of Wittenberg, not in the Department of Theology, but in the philosophy department. His forte was Aristotle. Now, Philip and Luther have very different personalities. Melanchthon was more irenic, more peace-loving, wanted things to kind of work out, try to keep things going neatly. But during their lifetime, Philip and Luther worked well together, and Melanchthon and Luther were a team. After Luther died, perhaps some of Philip's ironic, peaceful nature started to get a little stronger, so it gets him into a little trouble where he starts going too far and giving up too much.
Now, even though Charles V had won the Schmalkaldic War, he really lost. No one was happy with Charles, the Augsburg Interim, or even the Leipzig Interim. Lutheranism was entrenched and popular. The Lutheran princes refused to reconvert back to Catholicism. The Catholic princes liked their autonomy, and they actually felt threatened by the imperial troops on their soil. Maurice, the powerful Protestant ally of the emperor, was beginning to wonder if he made a mistake by betraying the Lutherans and allying himself with Charles. And the Pope wasn't happy either. Charles made a deal with the Protestants that involved compromising on Catholic religious practice. Charles had made some concessions to the Lutherans in exchange for peace and order. The church felt that Charles had no right to do that. That was the church's domain. So everyone was upset with Charles. The powerful Protestant Duke Maurice, who had been bribed to be an ally of Emperor Charles V, decides that it was more expedient for him to be viewed as a champion of Lutheranism than as a traitor. So he attacks Charles with the backing of the King of France, and he drives Charles' forces from Saxony.
So by 1555, what had happened was that Protestantism was so firmly entrenched within the Holy Roman Empire, there was really no way that the emperor had the authority or even the wherewithal to get rid of it. So in order to maintain peace and to prevent more religious wars from occurring, they're going to have to give it legal standing within the empire.
This will lead to the Treaty of Augsburg of 1555, which has significance for the church going forward, primarily because of the principle that it establishes of Cuius regio, huius religio, which translates roughly into whoever's in charge, his religion is what runs the show. And the idea of having two churches next to each other is still kind of, can't do that. And so the thought was, what we'll do then is the prince will determine the faith for his area. So if the prince, the ruler, is a Lutheran, everybody in his territory, you're a Lutheran. If the prince is Roman Catholic, everybody there, you're a Roman Catholic. That's how it was decided. And to us, that seems kind of like, where's the personal choice? No one cared about personal choice then. It was the point of we need to have unity. Here's how we're going to settle this. Done. And that's what they did for a while.
So the Peace of Augsburg set up a very interesting situation in the Holy Roman Empire. By granting adherents of the Augsburg Confession equal legal standing within the empire, it essentially accepted it as a viable option. So you're going to see a gradual transition in the discourse between the Catholics and the Protestants. Before that point in time, they really are still trying to persuade each other, hey, I'm right, you're wrong, here's how you're wrong, here's why I'm right. And then afterwards, you see this gradual transition to just where they just start knocking heads. So rather than talking with each other, they're talking at each other, and it becomes increasingly bitter and vitriolic. For the cities, the free imperial cities, this also becomes interesting because essentially the Peace of Augsburg allows the city councils to choose the religion of the city.
When the princes changed their allegiances, and when they switched, let's say, from Catholic to Lutheran, or Lutheran to Calvinist, or Calvinist to Lutheran, the people who were under the prince typically did not change locations.
So there are instances where you have a city that has a sizable Protestant population, but the city council is Catholic. So the official religion of the city is Catholic, but you have a sizable Protestant minority and there are too many to kick out and they won't shut up. So things became very, increasingly tense. By the time we get to the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, I think that poor Charles was just completely worn out with the whole thing.
So Charles found himself throughout his reign having to travel around between his various kingdoms to make sure everything was okay. When he leaves Spain at one point, he actually has rebellion there. He has to come back and deal with that. When he's back in Spain, he has rebellion in Germany. He has to go deal with that. He has war in Italy. Suddenly he has to move down to Italy. He's always putting out fires. And this is okay for a young man to do. A young man has the energy, but Charles, now entering into his 50s, this is tiring. And travel back then is not comfortable. It's very dangerous. And on top of that, wherever he goes, he feels like he's failed. He hasn't stamped out the Lutheran heresy. The Turks have taken most of Hungary. He has managed to keep the French at bay, but he's lost England to heresy too. So he decides to enter a monastery in Spain. He completely checked out of the business of government. Essentially, he lived like a monk and no longer like a king. And he died 2 years later.
He really struggled. I mean, this guy was kind of an ironic figure. On the one hand, he's sanctioning Cortez and the conquistadors to conquer all of South America, but he can't even keep his own empire together. On the one hand, he's decapitating the heads of the Frisian rebels and others, but he couldn't decapitate the faith of Luther. On the one hand, he says that this Lutheran thing is a monkish squabble or just an argument among monks, but on the other hand, he's exhausted by it, and he ends up abdicating the throne, and he ends up finishing his life in a monastery.
Before he abdicated, he divided his empire into two pieces. Ferdinand I would rule the Holy Roman Empire. Charles's son, Philip II, would rule Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and the Spanish possessions in the New World.
By the time of the Treaty of Augsburg, the Catholic Counter-Reformation had already begun. The Catholic Church had started the Council of Trent, which was formed to deal with the corruption in the Church and to deal with Protestant theology. The Catholic Church had also started the Order of the Jesuits. Today we know them for their schools and their universities, but back during the Reformation, they were kind of a fanatical militant group formed to directly confront Protestantism. Their constitution demanded the rejection of all opposing opinion or judgment, and they were to be completely obedient to the Pope. They sometimes used harsh means to purify the Catholic Church of corruption and to defeat Protestantism. Even other Catholics were afraid of their religious zeal. They would become a major force in the Catholic Inquisition.
Arsen, not only did you have conflicts between the different religious groups, you also had conflicts within each of these religious groups. So within the Lutherans, the major lines are the Philippists, those who followed Philip Melanchthon and were seen as compromisers, and the Gnesio-Lutherans who saw themselves as the true followers of Luther. And so I think this is one of the things that prompts the Lutherans to realize, hey, we are tearing ourselves apart, and if we don't do something, maybe the Catholics are going to come and shut us down. So the two principal theologians who are responsible for bringing the Lutherans back together again as Jakob Andrea and Martin Chemnitz. In 1580, they would compile in the Book of Concord the essential statements of faith of Lutheranism. So that includes the ecumenical creeds as well as the Lutheran confessions. So the intent of this was to remind Lutherans of what it is that they had in common, the things that they believed collectively, and to bring the different factions of Lutheranism together.
The Book of Concord is not a merely historical document. It's still very relevant today. When a pastor becomes a pastor in the Lutheran Church, he subscribes to the Book of Concord, which means this book determines my confession. It's what I confess. It will norm how I function. And it's fascinating that when you read it, it's vibrant and alive, and it speaks to issues, and people are often stunned at how relevant it is, because it is relevant, because it's God's truth. And it's not just merely a political thing that came up with or a theological document. It's God's truth, which contains theological truth and political truth, but it speaks to real life and real people.
Ferdinand II had managed to extirpate Protestantism in his region. He brought in Jesuit scholars, closed down Protestant schools and churches, and cast out all the teachers and pastors, and had managed within a few years to turn the tea roll from a Protestant Catholic kind of mix into a die-hard, fanatically Catholic county.
If anyone saith that man is truly absolved from his sins and justified, and that by this faith alone absolution and justification are effected, let him be anathema. The Council of Trent.
So what we have to think about at the end of the 16th century is that the religious landscape was shifting, and you have a re-energized Catholicism, a militant church. But the most dynamic Protestant group at the end of the 16th century were the Calvinists. Some of the territories that had converted to Protestantism had been reclaimed by Catholicism, and some areas had converted to Calvinism. But Calvinists weren't covered by the Peace of Augsburg, so technically speaking, they weren't legal. So this is going to create a lot of tensions.
One place where tension was high was the Kingdom of Bohemia. Most of the Bohemians, including the noble class, were Protestant. Matthias, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, was positioning himself to be the next king of Bohemia. And from there, he would later become the Holy Roman Emperor.
So when Matthias became king of Bohemia, he had to be elected by the nobles. And most of the nobles in Bohemia were Protestant. And they demanded certain concessions from Matthias before they were willing to give him the throne. And this included something known as the Letter of Majesty. The Letter of Majesty is significant because in this case, it allowed religious freedom on the individual level. The previous agreements within the empire had been at the princely level. It was, whatever the religion of the prince is, that's your religion. In this case now, it's allowing essentially freedom of conscience.
As from today, no person, neither of the higher free estates, nor the inhabitants of unfree towns and villages, nor the peasants, shall be forced or compelled by any device by the authorities over them, or by any person, spiritual or temporal, to forsake his religion and accept another religion. The Letter of Majesty.
So the idea of individual rights and freedom of conscience and I get to make my own choice, this is just unheard of.
This made the Bohemian Protestants thrilled. However, Matthias's other relative, Ferdinand II, a die-hard Jesuit-trained Catholic, was not thrilled with this idea.
Matthias is part of the Catholic Habsburg dynasty. They had rulers all over Europe. They were all related by marriage, but they didn't always get along.
Ferdinand II, as Archduke of the Tyrol, had managed to extirpate Protestantism in his region. He brought in Jesuit scholars, closed down Protestant schools and churches, and cast out all the teachers and pastors, and had managed within a few years to turn the Tyrol from a Protestant Catholic kind of mix into a die-hard fanatically Catholic county.
When Ferdinand II was elected to be the next king of Bohemia, he promised to honor the Letter of Majesty. The problem was that no one really thought that he was going to actually keep that promise. The Protestants, who knew of Ferdinand's reputation, were really upset. A meeting was called in Prague Castle to address their grievances.
Now, the meeting got a little heated because the Protestants were definitely afraid that their religious freedom was on the line. The Catholic representatives of Matthias, some of them were a little more amenable than others, and they were allowed to leave the room. However, two others and their secretary remained. These guys were the hardline anti-Protestant Catholics. These gentlemen thought that they were going to arrest them and they could become martyrs being wrongfully imprisoned by these gentlemen. What they did not expect was that the Protestants then grabbed them and threw them out the window. This is known as the defenestration of Prague.
So defenestration is just a long word. It simply means out the window. And actually, this is not the first defenestration of Prague. This has happened before in Prague, because apparently that's what angry Czechs do.
The previous defenestration of Prague that marked the Hussite Wars, the men that they threw out died. So they threw these men out, two of them and their secretary, and amazingly, all three of the men survived.
I've actually been to Prague. I've looked at the window. I've looked at it from the outside and the inside, and I can tell you it's a long drop. Now,
of course, this episode began to gather stories because these men managed to walk from such a terrible drop?
The Catholics said that they were saved or caught by angels of the divine hand.
The Protestants said, well, they landed on a pile of manure. Either way, this episode began the 30 Years' War.
As Ferdinand II is dealing with this issue, he is elected as the new emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He immediately prepares for war.
The war was an unmitigated disaster. It wiped out possibly up to a third of Germany's population. The human misery and the cost was terrible. So the armies oftentimes went unfunded, and the states did not have the capital to raise these forces. And so how these armies sustained themselves was by going into a territory. They occupied the territory. Cavalry served the purpose of spreading out, fanning over this territory, and collecting the contribution tax, usually in the form of food and supplies, and then bringing it back into the army. Naturally, peasants were devastated by this because they were not compensated for their material. It was justified as a tax, and they lost it. And the war moved around Germany based upon where armies had already been. If armies had been in a territory too long, it was unsustainable to stay there because all the food had been taken away. The troops would starve. For example, in the 1620s, a historian noted that when the Swedish army was in Estonia, the year before the Swedish army was there was close to, say, a couple thousand cattle, tens of thousands of chickens, and then on the tax registers the next year after the Swedish army had left, there were no cattle and 3 chickens left in the province. This is why peasants starved, and what this created was artificial famine within Germany. The war being so long and complicated, historians generally have divided up into 4 phases, first being the Bohemian phase, then the Danish phase, then the Swedish phase, then the French phase. The Bohemian phase, the Bohemians lost miserably. You even had Lutherans fighting on the side of the emperor. This terrified the nearby King of Denmark, who decided to intervene in the war and suddenly bringing an international element into this. The King of Denmark, however, was not ready to face off against the combined power of most of the German princes behind the emperor, and his territories were overrun and he lost. Then, using this as an excuse, Ferdinand continued to roll back Protestant privileges within the empire and assert more absolute power. This alarmed the King of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus, and he intervened, beginning the Swedish phase. Now, Gustavus Adolphus's army was the most modern army at the time. It was the most advanced militarily in terms of its techniques and technologies used. Historians today oftentimes refer to him as the father of modern warfare. His Swedish army was trained and experienced after fighting in Poland over most of the 1620s, and when they showed up in Germany, they won in battle after battle after battle. Within 2 years, he had conquered Prague, and he was at the gates of Vienna. Now, at this point, things went wrong for the Protestants. Gustavus died in battle. The story goes, his officers told him before a cavalry charge to put his armor on. He looked at them and he said, "The Lord God is my armor," and he charged off into battle. 30 minutes later, his horse came back without its rider. Gustavus had died, and the Protestant war effort at that point had lost its leader. The Catholics began to roll back the Protestant tide. This alarmed another power, and this was specifically France. Now, at this time, French foreign policy was not actually run by King Louis XIII. It was actually run by his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, as in a cardinal, a prince of the church, a man who elects the pope, a very, very Catholic individual. However, Richelieu had been actively, secretly aiding Protestant enemies of the Catholic Habsburgs wherever he could. He had been paying subsidies to the Swedes. He had also been paying subsidies to the Dutch in their wars against the Spanish. So in 1635, Richelieu declared war on the Spanish and then in turn declared war on their cousins, the Austrian Habsburgs, and this began the French phase of the war. Now there were the Lutheran princes on the side of the French and the Swedes, and some Lutherans even joined up on the side of the emperor, each one taking sides, trying to sort out the whole mess. The Swedes actually managed to take Prague by 1645, which, oddly enough, was the very place where the whole thing started. In 1648, the war, thankfully, was finally brought to a close in Germany with the Peace of Westphalia. The Peace of Westphalia was designed to be amenable to all parties to the treaty. However, it was not necessarily amenable to those outside of the war, and all parties agreed to ignore these sides, which included the papacy, which was furious with the fact that Protestantism had not been extirpated or rolled back at the end of the treaty. The Pope declared it null, void, invalid, iniquitous, unjust, damnable, reprobate, inane, and meaningless. European leaders, both Catholic and Protestant, ignored his opinion.
The 30 Years' War didn't end all of the fighting over Protestantism in Europe, but it did bring about the idea of a sovereign state where the rulers of the state, not the Pope, would be in charge. And the idea of freedom of conscience and individual rights would gain importance.
So Henry sent a request to the Pope in Rome asking for a dispensation of the marriage that would grant him an annulment. The only problem was
Henry's timing was horrible. Charles V was sacking Rome, and Charles V was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. The Lutheran Reformation was based on theological disagreements with the authorities in Rome, but the English Reformation was based more on power, economics, and King Henry VIII's grudge against the Pope. In 1521, the same year that Luther took his stand at the Diet of Worms, Pope Leo X awarded Henry VIII the title Fide Defensor, Defender of the Faith. Henry received this title for his book, Defense of the Seven Sacraments, which he dedicated to the Pope and wrote specifically against the theology of Martin Luther. Henry would write, "Do not listen to the insults and detractions against the Vicar of Christ, which the fury of the little monk spews up against the Pope." 4 years later, Henry had a dilemma. Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was now 40. She had given Henry one daughter, Mary, but her other 6 children, including 3 sons, had either died shortly after birth, or were miscarried, or were stillborn.
So Henry VIII, he was determined to have a male heir. So he wanted to have, really it was an annulment from Catherine of Aragon. And this is not atypical at all in European history because most marriages of political leaders are marriages of state. So they can be dissolved fairly easily. All you need is a dispensation from the Pope.
The lack of a legitimate male heir was not just an excuse for Henry, it was a real problem. Henry's father, Henry VII, had not acquired England's throne through legitimate means. He was just the winner of the last of the Wars of the Roses. And the Wars of the Roses had been off and on for decades. So Henry VIII, he needed a legitimate male heir in order to prevent war for a succession to the throne.
So Henry sent a request to the Pope in Rome asking for a dispensation of the marriage that would grant him an annulment. And again, not atypical at all. The only problem was
Henry's timing was horrible. Charles V was sacking Rome, and Charles V was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. The Pope was hardly going to grant an annulment that Charles's aunt would not have wanted.
This is another one of those times where the Pope and Emperor Charles V are busy handling other business while the Reformation is running at full speed. But this time, the Pope and Charles were at odds with each other. And basically, the Pope is being held hostage by Charles' troops as an imperial mercenary army is sacking Rome. The Pope had made an alliance with the Emperor's archenemy, the King of France, in an effort to undermine the Emperor. This didn't sit well with Charles. So Pope Clement VII is in no position to grant Henry, the defender of the faith, an annulment, even though earlier the Pope had granted an annulment for Henry's sister, the Queen of Scotland. Luther would later write, "Christ reigns in such a way that the emperor who persecutes Luther for the Pope is forced to destroy the Pope for Luther."
Henry had already entered into relations with Anne Boleyn prior to annulling his marriage or divorcing Catherine, and Anne happened to be pregnant. So if Henry wants a legitimate heir and Anne is pregnant, he can't risk that child being born out of wedlock in the event that it might be a son. So this is really, I think, what hastens him into breaking with Rome. And in 1534, he has Parliament pass the Act of Supremacy, which establishes him as the head of the church. The person who actually performs the divorce is the Archbishop of Canterbury, who becomes the prime religious office in England.
Now, you would think that breaking with Rome would be a big deal, but England had a long history of Protestant thought by English reformers like John Wycliffe, William Tyndale, and others. So the people were already sympathetic to reform. Plus, this was a political break from Rome, not a theological one. So if you were an average person, you didn't see a big difference in the church service or church doctrine or anything like that. Henry shut down monasteries and confiscated Catholic church land. He sold the land at a discount, which made his subjects happy. Some monks were paid to work the same church lands that they once worked for free. So in general, the people went along with the transition.
The breaking with Rome, and so that he could divorce Catherine, marry Anne, and after all of this, the child that she produces is a girl. And then what happens is Anne, from reports we can tell, she starts to become a nag. So not only is she not able to produce a male heir, she begins to nag Henry. So she's executed.
Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, is his favorite. She has Edward, and then 12 days later she dies. Henry is devastated by this because she had done nothing wrong, and she solved the problem that had existed for so long of not having a male heir.
Henry was married 3 more times. The last wife is, not only did she outlive Henry, I think she outsmarted him. From what we can tell, Catherine Parr was herself a Protestant, and she is the one who is responsible for raising Henry's 2 children, Edward and Elizabeth, after Henry's death.
It was crucial to the future of Protestantism in England that Henry allowed his son, Edward, to be raised by Protestants and allowed for his regency council to be made up mainly of Protestant nobles and clergy.
Henry was very conservative in his Reformation. He didn't change much at all. Everything is very conservatively Catholic. The only difference is the king is in charge.
Henry, of course, was no Protestant, but in his grudge against the Pope, he did something that was very Protestant, which was to allow the Bible in English to be in front of the people. The reason Henry eventually allowed the Bible to be in English was to diminish the power of the Pope. The Latin Bible was the Pope's Bible, the Bible from Rome. The English Bible would be the Bible of Henry's realm.
Upon the death of Henry, Edward becomes king. He's 9 years old, so he cannot rule on his own. Instead, he is under the rule of regents who take care of religious and political matters for him until he's of majority age. And they decide to make big changes to the Mass and to the other issues of the church in England. It becomes quite Protestant. There were protests among the priests, and some of the educated lay people protested, but most of the time the people just went along with it. Edward becomes sick and dies, and we don't know exactly how he died, but he died at home peacefully, kind of thing, you know?
The next heir in line for the throne after Edward VI was Mary. Mary was a very devout Catholic. She really clung tightly to her Catholic faith as a child. I think it's because she had been the unwanted child, the discarded child of Henry VIII after the humiliating divorce of her mother, Catherine. So there is an attempt to subvert the succession to Lady Jane Grey, who was Protestant. The English people actually rallied to Mary's cause, and I think that Mary believed it was because of religious reasons. I tend to think that the English rallied behind Mary for political reasons. They considered her the rightful heir, and I think it gave Mary some mistaken impressions about the English people when she became Queen of England.
Mary arranged a marriage with the Catholic King of Spain, Philip II, who was the son of the former Emperor Charles V. A deal was worked out so that Philip was the King of England in name only while he was married to Queen Mary, meaning that after she died, he would no longer be King of England or have any authority over England.
Problem for Mary, she's 40. Now, childbearing for women after age 40 is dicey in any age, but in the 16th century in particular, it's very dangerous. So she's not able to produce an heir. That means that the next person to succeed her is going to be Elizabeth. And Mary is fully aware that Elizabeth is Protestant and intends to return England to Protestantism. So Mary realizes that she doesn't have the time to bring England slowly back to Catholicism. She's going to have to impose it. So the last few years of her reign, we see several hundred Protestants are executed because of their faith. And this is often why she's called Bloody Mary. So those people who were very fervent Protestants, many of them left at the very beginning of her reign, went to various areas in Europe where they felt that they could worship freely. Some of them are going to end up in Calvin's Geneva, and they're going to be very much influenced by the ideas of Calvinism. But I think they also, as sort of exiles, realized the importance of having a stable state. So when Elizabeth comes to the throne later, she has a lot of popular support among the people, even if they don't always agree with her theologically, because they've been through that period of instability and of being exiles within a state. And really what they want is order and peace in which they can worship. So Elizabeth, when she came to the throne, had several problems. One of her problems was her gender. She was a woman. Women are not expected to rule, so she had to negotiate that. The other problem that Elizabeth has is she has sizable minorities of Catholics and very fervent Protestants that are Calvinists. So we could call them Puritans. They want to purify the church. Most of the English people have been through religious vicissitudes. If you just look at the reign of Henry VIII, we go back and forth, back and forth. Are we Catholic? Are we Protestant? What kind of Protestant? What kind of Catholic? Then we have Edward, who is very Protestant, and then we have Mary, who's very Catholic. And so when Elizabeth comes to the throne, her first aim is to reestablish stability of the state. And she feels she can do that by appealing to the broadest part of her people. So if you look at the Elizabethan settlement, it's really hard to identify it theologically. It has Lutheran influences, it has Calvinist influences, it has Catholic influences. So what she's looking for is a moderate position that will satisfy most people. But she continues to have the problem with those two, you could call them fringe groups if you would like, the fervent Catholics who will not compromise on one side, the fervent Puritans who will not compromise on the other. So she spends most of her reign navigating between those two poles.
The name Puritan was applied to these people because they insisted on a purer life and a purer way of worship. And so this title stuck, probably first as an insult, but then later as something they adopted.
So some of those fringe Protestants on the one side, they sort of diverge in different directions. There's a group of them who, in a sense, give up reforming the Anglican Church from the inside, and they end up separating from it, and they're called separatists. And a sizable group of them are going to emigrate to the New World and will end up in North America, and this is the Pilgrims. Another group are Puritans who want to purify the church, and a group of them will also emigrate a decade or so later to North America, and they end up in Massachusetts Bay. The situation in England is really interesting, particularly under Elizabeth. And remember, this is the period not only of the Counter-Reformation, but you have Philip, King of Spain, who's actually her brother-in-law. And as the papacy tries to re-energize Catholicism, in 1570, the Pope is going to issue a papal bull which basically gives permission to depose Elizabeth. And what they want to happen is all the Catholics in England to rise up and to overthrow Elizabeth. This actually makes Elizabeth's job much easier because when push comes to shove, the English are English first. And they trust Elizabeth to take care of them, that she is their sovereign.
In 1588, Philip II of Spain, the son of Emperor Charles V, and the former husband of Queen Mary, decides to invade England with the aim of overthrowing Protestant Queen Elizabeth. He plans to restore Catholicism to England. Pope Sixtus V grants the indulgences to the Spanish soldiers who take part in the expedition. They board 130 ships known as the Spanish Armada, and they sail towards England. Poor organization, bad weather, and an excellent naval strategy by the English caused the Armada to lose half of their ships. The failed invasion boosted the morale and national pride of the English under Queen Elizabeth. People saw it as God's hand protecting England and the Protestant cause. It was hailed as Christ's victory over the Antichrist. Commemorative medals from that period were inscribed with a Latin phrase which meant God blew, and they are scattered.
If anyone saith that the grace of justification is only attained to by those who are predestined unto life, but that all others predestined unto evil, let him be anathema. The Council of Trent.
What people don't understand about Luther at the beginning of the Reformation is that nobody knew that Luther would emerge as the great theologian that he was.
So the teaching of the Reformation is hardly unified and comprehensive and certainly not organized. It's sort of happening in different places.
Everyone sort of just started out with the idea that they would found their own reformations.
But as a person picks up a pamphlet by a Luther and reads and says, wow, he's right about that, but maybe he's not going far enough. And he goes further than Luther in his zeal to try to undo Catholic teaching. So you end up having different pockets of faith growing up in different geographical regions around the strong teaching of a key leader. So you could have different people like a Zwingli or like a Calvin later on, who has different ideas than Luther's, and then people start to pick up on this and follow that, and then that creates even more of the differences going forward.
So now you have John Calvin, this attorney, really, from Geneva. And with him, it wasn't enough to merely reform the church. He wanted a completely new sort of institution, which had an outward and visible manifestation of what it meant to be Christian. And so for Calvin, there was no distinction really between the civil realm and the spiritual realm. He wanted a completely new kingdom that he strove to usher in, beginning right there in Geneva.
And I think that one of the real driving motivations for Calvin was simply his confidence in human reason and his conviction that God wouldn't teach something or give us some truth that conflicted with human reason. And so if God is saying it, it's got to make sense. And so when Luther would come up to a problem that didn't quite make sense, he was willing to say, well, you know, God's God and I'm not, and I'm willing to back off and just submit my human reason to God's truth. Whereas Calvin would come up with a situation like that and say, well, there must be a good logical reason, so let's take that next step.
So John Calvin gave birth to Calvinism, and in our time there are very few pure Calvinists. The points that kind of distinguish Calvinism are the so-called tulip formula.
So 5-point Calvinism or tulip Calvinism is sort of the acronym we've come up with for total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. Those are your tulip acronyms.
So T is total depravity, namely that every person born has no power to come to God by herself or himself, that we're born sinful and separated from God, and it's because God chooses us, we don't choose God. And Lutherans would align with that, but would probably differ with the other 4 points of Calvinism. Unconditional election, namely that God chooses some to election unconditionally, but that God also chooses some to damnation. It's a double predestination. Limited atonement. So for whom does Jesus die? Calvinists would say it's limited atonement, that the death of Jesus is limited to the elect.
Limited atonement, big problem. Because when Christ died, he died for all, not just the elect. And this is clearly taught in Scripture, and it's critical. If I'm going to be able to announce the grace of God to people, or say God died for you, if I don't have a complete universal atonement, I can't say that. I can't look at any person and say, Christ died for your sins, because maybe he didn't. You're maybe not one of the elect. That's a big problem.
T-U-L-I, irresistible grace. So when God comes to you and Jesus chooses you to be his forever, can you reject that? Calvinists would say no, because the grace of God is irresistible. Lutherans would, of course, say you can reject God. You can't choose God, but you can reject God. And then finally, P, the perseverance of the saints. So once you're elect, once you're chosen, once you're in, can you ever be out? Lutherans would say, yeah, you can squander the gift that God has given you. Calvinists would say, no. Once you're in, you're rock solid in. There's nothing you can do to lose it.
So if I'm a Calvinist, I've got a concern, because only the elect are going to be going to heaven. Only the elect were paid for when Christ died. Christ did not die for everyone's sins, only for the elect. So here's the big question. Am I the elect or not? That's a big question. And how do you know? Because there's no list available. How do you know if your name's on the list? Well, the only way you can know is by looking for some kind of evidence. Maybe you see the Holy Spirit at work in you. You felt something that said, I should go help that person. Oh, that was the Holy Spirit. Oh, good, I'm okay. Or, look, my business is prospering. God is blessing my efforts, so I must be one of the elect. So you're looking for evidence for this, but you never know for sure. Because even the promise that Christ died for you, if you're the elect, well, maybe I'm not. Then you're in trouble.
Calvin was able to convince the authorities in Geneva to allow him to set up civil laws based on his principles. The idea was to make Geneva a Christian heaven on earth. But what he did was micromanage every aspect of society.
And he was very rigorous and vigorous about the outward display of Christianity. In fact, in that time it was said by some, you can do anything you want in Geneva as long as you don't have fun.
Calvin made no distinction between civil law and religious practice. Minor infringements carried harsh punishments. You could be fined or imprisoned for missing church. He prohibited all kinds of amusement, like gambling, singing, and dances. He forbade sweets to be served at wedding banquets. He decreed that all children born must be given biblical names. The color of garments was regulated. Dress was plain and modest because fashion was a sign of vanity. Citizens' homes were routinely inspected to make sure that all rules were being followed. Calvin was thin-skinned, and any criticism of him or his rules or any of his writings were harshly punished. While Calvinist Geneva was kind of a tyrannical nightmare for most of its people, Calvin's ideas and theology influenced many other Protestant groups like Baptists, Presbyterians, and the Puritans, just to name a few. Many groups adopted some of his ideas about piety, strong morals, and humble dress. Many Calvinists or Reform groups would later come to America to seek religious freedom.
It created new notions of learning, new notions of approaching science. A lot of these things had their intellectual roots within the Reformation. Essentially, the Reformation created the modern world. It created new notions of learning, new notions of approaching Scripture, new notions of approaching your vocation, new notions of approaching international politics, new notions of approaching science. A lot of these things had their intellectual roots within the Reformation. Without it, all I can assure you is that this world would look very, very different and think very, very differently without the Reformation.
So when Luther starts teaching at University of Wittenberg, society is very structured, very orderly. The church has its place, which is central, and everything fits around that. As Luther begins to do his careful theological thinking and realizing that the Pope is overreaching, and there are some of his teachings which are not actually accurate, and then as he discovers the reality of the gospel, and everything starts to change, before long, everything starts to get kind of touched by this because the church's reach is everywhere. And when the church's authority is questioned, it makes all of society come into question. And so now this has an impact on politics and an impact on business and even on the family and marriage. Everything starts to look different and people are rethinking everything. Some of the changes are probably welcome and good. Some of the changes probably weren't what Luther had in mind, especially generations down the road. But all this is coming out of the Reformation. This is all part of the impact of Luther's teaching, thinking about theology, and how it starts to affect all of life.
The Reformation had a huge impact on education, which is with us to this day. The idea of compulsory education, universal education for girls as well as boys. The idea of the work of a teacher as a real calling, a calling from God, which we have largely lost in society today, but that was very much there with the Reformation. And the idea of a curriculum that was broad-based, that would teach the liberal arts, that would make people into well-rounded church members and citizens. That all goes back to the Reformation.
European society was already in transition. It was changing. Medieval patterns were breaking down. The Reformation actually is going to accelerate it. And there are certain trends within European society that the Reformation is going to emphasize, this notion of the individual. So Luther's concern was for the individual to establish a relationship with God by grace through faith. So this notion of the individual is going to be a very important element in modern society. The concept that the state being in charge of the church is in some sense a modern concept as well, which we can see beginning in the Reformation. Changing social patterns, the changing structure of the family, many of these are legacies of the Reformation.
What does the Reformation mean today? From a historical perspective, for one, it's kept the Pope out of international politics, and it created a new situation where nation states use more reason of state as a reason for conducting foreign policy rather than notions of Christendom.
The General Reformation, it actually contributed many of the elements of our constitutional democracy, of our republic. It contributed things like the idea that the individual should be free to speak. It contributed the idea that the individual should be free to worship. Although that is not immediate, that is the consequence of the 30 Years' War. It also contributes the idea of representative democracy and contributes the idea of rights, at least for Christians, which then would be extended later to rights for all individuals in the time of the Enlightenment.
One of the really great things about right teaching is that it starts to impact all of life. And that's one of the things I get excited about with theology is it's not just about me and God or what happens when I die or what happens on Sunday morning. Good theology impacts everything. And one of Luther's great gifts that beautifully illustrates this is his teaching on vocation. Luther realized that one of the big mistakes that was being made in the medieval world was this notion that if you really wanted to serve God, if you really wanted to get right with God, you had to forsake the world and go join a monastery or a convent, and if there you could really pursue godly things, and there you could get right with God. And Luther came to realize that not only is this wrong because it teaches works righteousness, trying to earn favor with God, but it's also wrong because it destroys this world. Because it takes a man out of his relationships and responsibilities in this world and drives him into this isolated life in the monastery, where he's of no good to anyone. So Luther said, no, the doctrine of vocation is God's affirmation of this world, God's affirmation of the things we do in this world. So when a man chooses to marry and raise children, this is good and God-pleasing. So this allowed Luther to invest heavily in his own married life. He loved his wife, he loved his children, he loved music, he loved meals with his family, and he learned to delight in those domestic things. In the medieval world, those were always seen as low down, common things. Those weren't holy works. Those were just, you just got to do that. it's too bad somebody has to do this. But Luther said, no, this is holy, beautiful, godly work. And so he elevated family and married life and children and parenting to a high level, which was unheard of in his world. And this, I think, legacy endures to this day. So a Christian can embrace his responsibilities and her responsibilities in this world because it's God-pleasing and it's holy and it's honorable. That's kind of a great gift, I think, that Luther gave us.
Marriage in the Middle Ages had been a sacrament. When Luther married Katie, Katharina von Bora, he was actually making a statement, actually more than one statement by that act. One is priesthood of all believers. What he was saying is that the priests are not a special class that are closer to God than anybody else. He was also establishing a new tradition among Protestants, the Protestant parsonage. So the wife and the family become a very important part of the Reformation process. More broadly, what we're going to see happening is the extension of the authority of the state over areas that in the Middle Ages had been the province of the church. So marriage is one of those examples. Education is another.
As modern American Christianity drifts farther and farther away from Scripture, the Reformation gives us a model. Go back to the Scriptures. Go back to sola scriptura. Focus on the Scriptures. Focus on faith. Focus on the truth that God provides us.
So Lutheranism is an amazingly resilient phenomenon globally. And Lutheranism is now clearly a global movement, which is one of the most exciting parts of Lutheranism. The average Lutheran in the world now looks like an East African, because we see now the church just blossoming, more than blossoming, booming in East Africa, in Ethiopia, in Tanzania, in Madagascar. And so Lutheranism is proving itself to be amazingly resilient globally. So I think part of the resilience of Lutheranism was established by Luther himself. You see, Luther demanded that the Bible be translated into the language of the people. In fact, he once said, God be praised, finally the Bible is in the language of the people. So there's something that is native to Lutheranism around adaptation or the vernacular or cultural contextualization. And I think that's one of the variables that gives Lutheranism this kind of resilience through the 20th century to find it growing again in places like Latin America and Asia and Africa.
Luther starts small and starts innocently, but God has other intentions for this, and his intention is to bring truth back to his church. And that's what the real legacy is. The gospel is being proclaimed again. The promise is there. The clarity of God's truth is there. That's the great heritage, and that, I think, is the responsibility that we who carry the name Lutheran have today. Our charge then is to keep on moving forward, teaching the full counsel of God. All that he says about the gospel, God's free gift, all that he says about this world and how embracing this world is a good and God-pleasing thing and living in this world for the sake of the world, that's what God put us here to do. That's part of our legacy. And when we are able to help the church, the wider church, come to terms with this is a really good thing. And this is part of what it means to be a Lutheran.
The greatest thing about the Reformation are the solas: grace alone, faith alone, Christ alone, Scripture alone. Because in reality, what it does is it establishes the worth of a human being before God in a way that can't be done by people. It's done by God in Jesus Christ. Now, if you really believe that, if that's what you believe the dignity of humanity is, it changes everything about what it means to be human together in society. And so there's going to be tremendous change in society, a lot of it for great good. But it comes back to that unique dignity before God in Jesus Christ alone. What a great way to live together.